When I showed up, my son and his in-laws had already wrapped up their year-end meal. My son sneered, "You're late, Dad. You'll cover the check, right?" My daughter-in-law smirked, still as slow as always. They all laughed loudly. I summoned the manager suddenly. Their faces went pale. Have you ever walked into a room, expecting a warm family dinner, only to realize the joke's on you, and you're the punchline? It felt like my entire world shattered in that moment, when my own son smirked and told me to pick up the check for a meal I hadn't even eaten. And his wife, oh, she just laughed. A sharp, careless sound, calling me slow as if it was a pre-rehearsed act they'd all agreed upon. They thought I'd just sigh, pull out my card, and swallow the shame, just like always. But what they didn't know was that I'd finally seen them for who they really were. And I was done pretending this was love or family. This isn't just a story about a dinner bill or a public insult. No. This is about a betrayal that cuts so deep because it comes from your own child. It's about a humiliation that burns because it's served with laughter by people who should care. And it's about a revenge that doesn't scream, doesn't beg, and absolutely doesn't miss. Stick with me, because the twist they never saw coming is exactly what made them realize they picked the wrong man to mock. And the bill they thought I would pay, well, that was nothing compared to the price they were about to face. My name is Richard Lawson. I'm 63, a retired structural engineer. For 40 years, I designed bridges and overpasses across Wyoming, believing that building strong things meant something. That if you created structures meant to last, the same principles would hold true for family. I was so wrong about that. The restaurant was called Carmichael's, one of those places where the menus don't list prices, and the waiters speak in hushed tones like they're serving communion. I'd never been there before. When my son, Daniel, texted me the address 3 days earlier, year-end family dinner, 7 p.m. sharp, I assumed it was his way of making amends for missing Thanksgiving. I even wore the blazer Grace, my late wife, had given me that last Christmas, thinking it might be nice to look presentable. I arrived at 7:02 p.m. 2 minutes late, because I'd circled the block looking for parking that didn't cost $20 an hour. When the hostess led me to the private dining room, I heard the laughter before I saw them. It was that kind of laughter that stops when someone walks in, not because they are surprised, but because the joke asterisk was asterisk about you. The table was cluttered with empty plates. Steak bones picked clean, lobster shells cracked open, wine glasses still holding the last red swirls of something expensive. They'd already finished eating. All of them. Daniel, my son, sat at the far end, his napkin folded neatly beside a dessert plate smeared with chocolate. His wife, Evelyn, barely looked up from her phone. Her parents, Thomas and Linda Carter, occupied the head of the table like visiting royalty. They had this particular smugness, you know, the kind that says, "We've earned everything we have." "Dad," Daniel said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You made it." "Traffic." I lied. There hadn't been any. Nobody stood to greet me. Nobody pulled out a chair. I found an empty seat between a busboy's cart and the wall, the only place setting without food stains. Thomas Carter swirled his wine glass, looking at me the way you might look at a stain on expensive upholstery. "Richard, good of you to join us. We were just discussing investments. Probably not your area of expertise, but feel free to listen." Linda laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Thomas, don't be cruel. I'm sure Richard has his own simple pleasures. Fishing, isn't it? Or was it woodworking?" "Both," I said. "How quaint." She exchanged a glance with Evelyn, quick, practiced, like they'd rehearsed it. The conversation continued around me as if I were furniture. Thomas bragged about a commercial development deal that would change the chain's skyline. Linda dropped names of country club members and charity boards. Evelyn finally put down her phone long enough to mention their upcoming renovation, the new kitchen island that cost more than my first car. Daniel said nothing. He just studied his water glass like it contained the secrets of the universe. I watched them. That's what 40 years of engineering teaches you, how to observe load-bearing points, stress fractures, the places where structures fail. Thomas's expensive watch caught the candlelight, but his shoes were scuffed at the heels, the leather cracking. Linda's jewelry was impressive until you noticed she kept touching her neck, adjusting the clasp of a necklace that didn't quite fit. Evelyn's designer bag sat on the table, but the stitching on the handle was fraying. The performance was good, but the structure beneath it felt weak. The bill arrived in a leather folder, placed deliberately in the center of the table. Nobody reached for it. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and slid it toward me with an awkward laugh. "You don't mind, do you, Dad? Since you missed the meal anyway." I opened the folder. $847. For a dinner I hadn't eaten. At a restaurant I hadn't chosen. With people who hadn't even wanted me there. I placed my card on the folder without a word. The waiter took it, giving me a look I recognized. The quiet sympathy of someone who understands humiliation but can't intervene. When he returned with a receipt, I signed my name slowly, carefully. And that's when I saw it. Evelyn was watching me, not with the contempt I'd grown accustomed to, but with something sharper. Her eyes moved from my face to my hand to the card I was tucking back into my wallet. She wasn't just insulting me, I realized. She was measuring me. I drove home that night with Evelyn's calculating eyes burned into my mind. Not contempt, but calculation star. The distinction kept nagging at me, like a loose thread I couldn't stop pulling. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the thread had begun to unravel something I wasn't prepared to see. The house was dark, except for the porch light I'd left on out of habit. Grace used to tease me about that, leaving lights on for nobody, as if I expected her to come home late from one of her book club meetings. 5 years since she passed, and I still couldn't break the habit. I sat in my truck for a long moment, engine off, replaying the evening frame by frame, like an engineer reviewing footage of a structural failure. The inconsistencies surfaced slowly at first, then all at once. Daniel had texted me at 4:15 p.m. that afternoon, dinner at 7. "Call me, Shells. Don't be late." But when I scrolled up through my messages, I found another text from 3 days earlier. This one from Evelyn. "Family dinner Sunday, 6:30 p.m. 6:30, not 7. I'd seen Daniel's message first and assumed it was the correct time. I never thought to cross-reference. The reservation was under Thomas's name, not Daniel's. My son hadn't organized anything. He'd been a guest at his own father-in-law's table, just like me, except he'd known when to arrive. And this year-end dinner. When did that become a tradition? Grace and I never did anything like it. Daniel and I had always celebrated New Year's Eve together, just the two of us, with takeout and a movie, after she died. This formal gathering, this expensive restaurant, these people who'd never shown interest in spending time with me before, none of it fit the pattern of our family. Because it wasn't our family. It was their star. I went inside and poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, something I rarely did anymore. The kitchen was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. On the wall hung a photograph from Daniel and Evelyn's wedding, 7 years ago now, at that vineyard in California that cost more than my truck. Grace had insisted we pay for half. "He's our only son," she'd said. "We want to give him a good start." Looking at the photo now, I remembered something I'd buried for years. Grace standing beside me during the reception, watching Evelyn chat with her mother near the cake table. Both women had been smiling at Daniel with identical expressions, appraising. Satisfied. Like collectors who'd just acquired a valuable piece. "That girl watches you like you're a wallet, not a father," Grace had whispered. I'd laughed it off, told her she was being overprotective. Evelyn was young, ambitious. Wasn't that what we wanted for Daniel? Someone who would push him to succeed? But Grace hadn't laughed. She just squeezed my hand and said nothing more. I remembered something else from that night. Linda Carter's toast. She'd stood up with her champagne glass raised, her voice carrying that performative warmth that never quite reached her eyes. "To my beautiful daughter and her wonderful husband," she'd said, "may your partnership be everything you dreamed of. After all, marriage is the best investment a woman can make." The guests had chuckled politely. I'd assumed it was a joke. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen, 7 years later, I wasn't so sure. I pulled out a notebook, the same kind I'd used for decades of engineering calculations, and began writing. Not numbers this time. Incidents. Last Thanksgiving, Evelyn had called me the morning of the holiday, her voice bright with false apology. "Oh, Richard, I completely forgot to mention we're doing dinner at my parents' place this year. You're welcome to come, Of course. But I know it's last minute. I'd spent Thanksgiving alone, eating a turkey sandwich and watching football. Daniel's fishing trips. We used to go every spring, just the two of us, up to Yellowstone. 3 years running, now he'd cancelled. Work emergencies. Evelyn's schedule conflicts. The kids. Except Daniel and Evelyn didn't have kids. So that excuse never even made sense. The loans. $2,000 for a temporary cash flow issue 18 months ago. Another $1,500 for unexpected car repairs last spring. $1,000 6 months ago for reasons Daniel never fully explained. All promised to be repaid next month. None of them ever were. I'd stopped asking because I didn't want to seem like the kind of father who kept score. But someone had been keeping score. Just not me. I stared at the list in my notebook, the pattern emerging like cracks in a foundation. Each incident had tested something specific. Would I make a fuss about Thanksgiving? No asterisk would I push back on the fishing trips? No asterisk would I demand my money back? No asterisk would I pay a $900 dinner bill without complaint? No asterisk the dinner wasn't about the bill. It was an audition. They wanted to see how much I would tolerate. They wanted to know if I would fight back, or if I would simply break. I closed the notebook and finished my bourbon in one long swallow. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows the way it always did in late December. Grace's voice echoed in my memory, clearer now than it had been in years. That girl watches you like you're a wallet. I should have listened. 3 days passed before I worked up the courage to confront Daniel. 3 days of replaying conversations, reviewing my notebook, and arguing with myself about whether I was being paranoid or finally seeing clearly. By Wednesday morning, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. I needed to hear my son explain himself. I needed to understand how the boy who once held my hand at his mother's funeral had become a man who could slide a $900 bill across a table without flinching. Their house sat in one of those new developments on the east side of town. Identical beige structures with identical landscaping. The kind of neighborhood where everyone's lawn looks the same because the HOA demands it. I'd helped with the down payment 4 years ago. Another loan that was never repaid, though I'd stopped counting those. I barely had time to knock before the door swung open. Evelyn stood there in yoga pants and a cashmere sweater, her smile so bright it nearly blinded me. "Dad, what a surprise." She stepped forward as if to hug me, then thought better of it. "Daniel didn't mention you were coming." "He didn't know." "Well, come in, come in." She ushered me through the foyer with the practiced warmth of a real estate agent showing a property she doesn't expect to sell. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Water? We have that sparkling kind you like." I'd never told her I like sparkling water. I didn't. "I'm fine. Is Daniel here?" "He's in the garage, tinkering with something or other. You know how he is." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of glass. "I'll let him know you're here." But before she could move, Daniel appeared in the hallway behind her. He was wearing an old flannel shirt I recognized from a decade ago, his hair uncombed, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who hasn't been sleeping well. When he saw me, something flickered across his expression. Surprise, yes, but something else, too. Something that looked almost like fear. "Dad!" He glanced at Evelyn. "Everything okay?" I wanted to talk about Sunday. The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Evelyn's smile didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened. Daniel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Sunday." Evelyn tilted her head. "Oh, the dinner. That was lovely, wasn't it? I'm so sorry about the timing mix-up. You know how these family things get. Everyone's texting different information. It was just a misunderstanding." "You know how these things happen," Daniel added, his voice flat. The words sounded rehearsed, like lines from a script he'd memorized but didn't believe. "Can we talk?" I looked directly at my son. "Just the two of us." Evelyn's smile flickered for just a moment. "Of course. I need to make some calls anyway. Take your time." She retreated down the hallway, her footsteps deliberately casual, but I noticed she left the door to the study slightly ajar. Daniel led me to the garage. It was cold out there, the concrete floor radiating winter chill through my boots. He moved to a workbench cluttered with tools and began organizing wrenches that didn't need organizing, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. Daniel, I kept my voice low. Did you know they planned it that way? The different times, arriving late, the bill. Did you know? His eyes darted toward the door that led back into the house. Dad, please. His voice was barely above a whisper. Let it go. I can't let it go. I need to understand what's happening here. He turned to face me then, and for a moment, I saw something beneath the exhaustion. Not weakness, but warning. His phone sat on the workbench, positioned face down. A tiny red light blinked near the edge, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. He was recording. The realization hit me like cold water. But recording asterisk what asterisk? And for whom? I remember Daniel at 8 years old, building a birdhouse in this very garage. A different garage, a different house, but the same boy with sawdust in his hair and pride in his eyes. I remembered him at 15, sitting beside Grace's hospital bed during her first cancer scare, reading aloud from her favorite novels because he couldn't bear to see her afraid. I remembered him at 22, giving the eulogy at her funeral, his voice cracking but never breaking. That boy was still in there somewhere. I had to believe that. I should go, I said finally. Daniel walked me to my truck. Evelyn was watching from the kitchen window, her phone pressed to her ear. At the driver's door, he stopped me with a hand on my arm. His grip was firmer than I expected. Dad! His voice was so quiet, I almost missed it. Be careful what you say around her. Walls have ears. The words sounded like surrender. But the tone was something else entirely. A warning. A message I wasn't meant to understand yet. I drove home with my thoughts churning. I'd gone there expecting to lose my son completely. Instead, I'd found something I couldn't quite name, a contradiction, a puzzle with missing pieces. I didn't lose my money that night at Carmichael's. I thought I'd lost my son. But looking back now, I wonder if he was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. Daniel's warning echoed in my mind for days. Be careful what you say around her. Walls have ears. I turned the words over like stones in my pocket, trying to understand what lay beneath them. Was he protecting himself? Protecting me? Or was it something else entirely? A message wrapped in the language of surrender. I didn't have long to wonder. The following Saturday, Evelyn's white SUV appeared in my driveway without warning. I watched from the kitchen window as she stepped out, smoothing her coat and checking her reflection in the side mirror. She carried a leather folder under one arm, the kind lawyers used for important documents. My stomach tightened. Whatever this was, it wasn't a social call. I opened the door before she could knock. Richard. She beamed as if we were old friends reuniting after years apart. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I was in the neighborhood and thought we could chat. She'd never been in the neighborhood in the 5 years since Grace died. My house sat on 3 acres outside town, surrounded by nothing but farmland and silence. Nobody ended up here by accident. Come in, I said, because refusing would only delay whatever she'd come to do. She settled onto the couch Grace had picked out 20 years ago, crossing her legs and placing the leather folder on the coffee table between us. Her movements were precise, rehearsed, like an actress hitting her marks. I've been thinking about family, she began, her voice warm with manufactured sincerity. About unity, about how important it is for generations to support each other, especially in uncertain times. Uncertain times. I repeated. You know how it is. The economy, the markets, all that unpredictability. She waved a manicured hand. Daniel and I have been discussing the future. Your future specifically. We want to make sure you're protected. Protected from what? She laughed, a sound designed to disarm. From bureaucracy, mostly. Estate planning can be such a nightmare when it's not handled properly. Probate courts, inheritance taxes, all those horrible delays. She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. We thought it might make sense to add Daniel and me to the deed of your house, just for planning purposes. A lawyer friend of mine can handle everything quickly and quietly. No fuss, no expense to you. There it was. The real reason for the dinner, the humiliation, the months of small tests. They weren't just greedy, they were strategic. I kept my face neutral, a skill I'd perfected over decades of contract negotiations with developers who thought engineers were easy to fool. That's thoughtful of you, Evelyn. I'll have to think it over. Of course. Her smile didn't waver, but I caught the flicker of frustration behind her eyes. She'd expected less resistance. Take all the time you need. Though sooner is usually better with these things. You never know what might happen. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. I decided to test something. Speaking of planning ahead, how's your father's new development project? Thomas mentioned at dinner. Sounded like quite an opportunity. The change was microscopic but unmistakable. Evelyn's smile froze for half a second. Her fingers twitched against the leather folder. When she spoke, her voice was a fraction too bright, her recovery a fraction too smooth. Oh, Dad's always got something in the works. You know how entrepreneurs are, always chasing the next big thing. She stood abruptly, gathering her folder. I should let you get back to your day. Think about what I said, Richard. Family should stick together. She was out the door before I could respond. I waited until her SUV disappeared down the road, then grabbed my keys. 20 minutes later, I was driving past the Carter family home, a sprawling colonial in the wealthiest part of Cheyenne, the kind of house that announces its owner's success from the street. But something was different. Partially hidden behind a row of hedges, barely visible unless you knew to look, stood a for sale sign with a foreclosure notice stapled to the post. I pulled over and called Frank Morris, a realtor I'd known for 30 years. He owed me a favor from a bridge project that had saved his commercial plaza from flooding back in the 90s. The Carter place. Frank's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who deals in other people's misfortunes. Yeah, that's been in pre-foreclosure for about 8 months now. Bank's been patient, but patience runs out. Word is, Thomas's business went under 2 years ago. Some development deal that collapsed. They've been living on credit and appearances ever since. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the house through my windshield. The lawn was immaculate. The windows gleamed. 2 luxury cars sat in the driveway. Every visible detail screamed prosperity. But beneath the surface, the foundation was crumbling. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Thomas's bragging at dinner wasn't confidence. It was desperation. The performance of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Linda's obsession with investment wasn't philosophy. It was survival strategy, passed down to her daughter like a family trade. The expensive restaurant, the designer clothes, the elaborate charade of success. All of it was scaffolding around an empty structure. And Evelyn hadn't married Daniel for love. She'd married him for *access star. Access to me. To the house Grace and I had paid off 15 years ago. To the retirement accounts I'd built over 4 decades of careful saving. To everything I'd earned through a lifetime of honest work. The dinner humiliation made sense now. It wasn't random cruelty. It was conditioning. They wanted to establish dominance, to train me into compliance, before making their real move. Pay the bill without complaint. Accept the insults without protest. Learn to say yes, so that when the big ask came, the house, the deed, my entire life's work, I'd already be broken. They'd done this before. I could feel it. The smoothness of Evelyn's pitch. Linda's rehearsed cruelty. Thomas's desperate bravado. These weren't amateurs stumbling through a scheme. They were experienced. Practiced. I drove home slowly, my mind working through the implications. The bill at the restaurant was never the prize. My house. My savings. My entire life's work. That's what they came for. And they thought I'd hand it over without a fight. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, with Grace's photograph watching me from the mantel. The house felt emptier than usual. The silence heavier. I'd spent 40 years solving structural problems, calculating loads, identifying stress points, designing solutions that would hold under pressure. But this wasn't a bridge or an overpass. This was my family, and I had no idea where to begin. Then I remembered a name I hadn't spoken in 5 years. Michael Reeves. He'd been Grace's lawyer long before he became mine. They'd met at a charity fundraiser in the early 90s, 2 people who shared a belief that preparation was the highest form of love. He'd handled our estate planning, our wills, all the paperwork that couples accumulate over decades of building a life together. After Grace's funeral, he'd sent a card and left a voicemail I never returned. Grief has a way of making you retreat from anyone who reminds you of what you've lost. I found his number in an old address book Grace had kept in her desk drawer. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed. It was nearly 9 p.m., too late for a business call, early enough that he might still be awake. He answered on the second ring. Richard. His voice carried no surprise, only a kind of quiet recognition. I've been waiting for this call. You have? Grace told me you'd reach out eventually. She just didn't know when. The words landed like a punch to the chest. Grace had been gone for 5 years. Whatever Michael knew, he'd been holding it all that time, waiting for me to be ready. Can we meet? I asked. Tomorrow, my office, 9 a.m. He paused. And Richard, bring patience. What I have to show you isn't simple. Michael's office occupied the second floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of place that smelled of old paper and integrity. I'd been there twice before. Once to sign our original wills. Once to update them after Daniel's wedding. The walls were lined with law books and framed photographs, Michael with his late wife, his children, his grandchildren. A life built on trust and careful planning. He met me at the door with a handshake that lingered a moment longer than necessary. His hair had gone completely white since I'd last seen him, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Sit down, he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. This is going to take a while. He didn't waste time on small talk. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with tape that had turned brittle over time. Grace's handwriting marked the front. For Richard, when he's ready. She came to me 3 weeks before she died, Michael said, settling into his own chair. I thought it was about updating the will, routine stuff, given her diagnosis. But that wasn't why she was here. Then why? She was worried. Not about dying. About what would happen to you after. He folded his hands on the desk. She'd noticed things. Changes in Evelyn's behavior. Daniel's increasing withdrawal. Small patterns that most people would dismiss. But Grace wasn't most people. No, she wasn't. Grace had always seen what others missed. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and one of the things I'd most often ignored. She told me something I've never forgotten, Michael continued. She said, when Richard is ready to fight, give him the tools. Not before. Hope should always come before war. He tapped the envelope. This is what she left you. But I'm not allowed to give you everything yet. What do you mean, not allowed? Grace set conditions. Triggers that had to be met before certain documents could be released. She didn't want you to go to war prematurely. She wanted you to have a chance to be wrong about them, to give Daniel a chance to choose the right side. I stared at the envelope, my throat tight. Even from beyond the grave, Grace was protecting me, protecting Daniel, trying to preserve something that might already be beyond saving. What's in there? Michael leaned back. The basics, I can tell you. Grace created a living trust with provisions I've never seen before in 30 years of practice. It's designed to protect your assets in ways that are almost impossible to circumvent, legally. There's also a file of documentation, records, observations, things she noticed and wrote down. And there are instructions that activate under specific conditions. What conditions? If someone attempts to gain control of your property through coercion or manipulation. If there's evidence of financial exploitation. If you're ever threatened with guardianship proceedings based on false claims. He paused. Has any of that happened yet? I thought about Evelyn's proposal, the deed, the lawyer friend who could handle everything quickly and quietly. It's starting to, I said. Michael nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing less. Then we're entering the first phase. I can give you the overview to help you understand what Grace built. But the full contents of that envelope, the evidence she gathered, the details of the trust defensive clauses, those stay sealed until the conditions are fully met. Why, if she wanted to protect me? Because she wanted to protect Daniel, too. Michael's voice softened. Grace believed people could change. She didn't want to destroy your son's marriage or his life unless there was no other choice. The triggers exist to make sure you're not acting on suspicion alone. When you have proof, real, undeniable proof, then you'll have everything you need. I sat in silence, processing the weight of what Grace had done. She'd spent her final weeks not just preparing to die, but preparing me to survive without her. She'd anticipated threats I couldn't see and built defenses I didn't know existed. She really saw all this coming, I said finally. Michael looked at me with something like admiration mixed with sorrow. Your wife saw this coming 5 years ago, Richard. She built you a fortress. He paused, his gaze meeting mine. They are standing on ground that was never theirs. I left Michael's office that afternoon with a new understanding of the battlefield I was standing on. Grace had built me a fortress, but fortresses only work if the enemy doesn't know they exist. The moment the Carters suspected I was anything other than a confused old man, slowly warming to their attention, they'd change tactics. They'd become more careful, more subtle, harder to catch. I needed them confident. I needed them careless. So, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had. I decided to let them win. 2 weeks later, Evelyn called to invite me to a family barbecue at Daniel's house. Her voice dripped with sweetness, the kind that left a sticky residue. We'd love to have you, Dad. It's been too long since we all spent time together as a family. I accepted without hesitation, and her pause on the other end of the line told me she'd expected more resistance. The barbecue was everything I anticipated, and worse. Thomas manned the grill like a general commanding troops, his voice too loud, his gestures too broad. Linda circulated with a wine bottle, refilling glasses with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that drunk guests reveal more than sober ones. Evelyn played hostess with a kind of performative warmth that made my skin crawl. And Daniel stood in the corner, watching everything with an expression I couldn't quite read. Richard. Thomas approached me with a plate of overcooked steak, his cheeks flushed from heat and alcohol. Good to see you loosening up. Family's important. You know. Too many people forget that these days. I'm starting to remember, I said. He clapped me on the shoulder, hard enough to make me stumble. That's the spirit. Finally showing some family spirit. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. Evelyn tells me you're considering her proposal. Smart man. Very smart. No point letting the government take half of everything when you're gone, right? I nodded and said nothing. He seemed to take my silence as agreement. Linda appeared at my elbow with a glass of red wine, her smile so wide it looked painful. Richard, I'm so glad we're getting past all that awkwardness. Families should support each other. She pressed the glass into my hand with a look of triumph she didn't bother to hide. To new beginnings. I raised the glass and pretended to drink. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn's confidence grew like a weed in fertile soil. She stopped asking permission and started making announcements. When we update the deed, we should have our lawyer look at the whole estate plan, she told Daniel, within earshot of me. Dad's setup is probably outdated anyway. She discussed renovation ideas for my house, as if I weren't sitting 10 feet away. That back porch would make a gorgeous sunroom. And the kitchen's too small. When we're all living closer together, we'll need more space for entertaining. I watched Daniel's jaw tighten each time she spoke. His hands gripped his soda can so hard the aluminum crinkled. But he said nothing. His silence could have been complicity. It could have been something else entirely. I thought about his phone, face down on the workbench, the tiny red light blinking. I played my role perfectly. I asked Thomas about his business ventures, nodding along as he spun elaborate tales of deals in progress and investors lining up. But I noticed how he drank steadily, desperately, the way men drink when they're trying to drown something. Halfway through his third beer, his complaints slipped out like secrets. Ungrateful investors, he muttered. You build something from nothing, and they want guarantees. Nobody understands risk anymore. Linda excused herself to make a phone call, stepping inside with her cell phone pressed to her ear. Through the window, I watched her pace the kitchen, her face growing paler with each passing minute. When she returned, her smile was intact, but her hands were shaking. She poured herself a generous glass of wine and drank half of it in one swallow. Evelyn checked her phone constantly throughout the afternoon, not for messages, but for something else. Her banking app. I recognized the familiar swipe pattern. Each time she looked at the screen, her smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. The performance of prosperity was cracking under its own weight. These people were drowning. The foreclosure sign behind the hedges. Thomas's bankrupt business. The desperate phone calls and empty bank accounts. They were performing a play called Success for an audience of one in me. The mark. The solution to all their problems. I let them believe it was working. When Evelyn cornered me near the dessert table to press her case about the deed, I rubbed my chin thoughtfully and said, "You might be right about the estate planning. Let me think on it a few more days." Her eyes lit up like I'd handed her a winning lottery ticket. "Take all the time you need, Dad," she said, squeezing my arm. "We just want what's best for everyone." As I drove home that evening, I replayed every interaction, cataloging details, the way I used to catalog stress points in bridge designs. Thomas's desperation, Linda's fear, Evelyn's barely concealed greed, and Daniel, silent in the corner, his jaw tight, his eyes watching everything. I let them celebrate a victory they hadn't earned. Every smile I gave them was a rope they'd eventually hang themselves with. They just didn't know it yet. 3 nights after the barbecue, I was sitting in my living room, reading a biography of a bridge engineer I'd admired since college, when headlights swept across my front windows. It was past 11, too late for visitors, too early for emergencies. I set down the book and moved to the window, my hand instinctively reaching for the baseball bat I kept by the door. Daniel's car sat in my driveway, engine still running, headlights cutting through the darkness. He stepped out alone, his movements jerky and rushed, and crossed to my porch without bothering to lock the vehicle behind him. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, his hair uncombed, as if he'd driven here straight from bed. "Dad," his voice cracked on the single syllable. "We need to talk. Not here. Somewhere she can't hear." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my jacket and followed him to the car. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, past the edge of town and into the empty darkness of rural Wyoming. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. Every few seconds he checked a rearview mirror, watching for headlights that never appeared. He finally pulled into the parking lot of a truck-stop diner I hadn't visited in years, the kind of place where the coffee is burned and nobody asks questions. At this hour, only 2 other cars sat in the lot, long-haul truckers grabbing a late meal. Before pushing on, we took a booth in the corner, far from the windows. Daniel ordered coffee with hands that trembled so badly he spilled half of it trying to add sugar. He didn't drink. He just wrapped his fingers around the mug like he needed something to hold on to. "Dad, I need you to understand something." He finally met my eyes, and I saw something there I hadn't seen since he was a boy, vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "I'm not who you think I am. I'm not who she thinks I am either. Tell me." He took a shaky breath. "Since the dinner, since that night at Carmichael's, I've been recording her. Every conversation I could capture. Phone calls, arguments, the plans she discusses with her parents." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, setting it on the table between us. "It's all on here. Months of evidence." I stared at the drive, trying to process what he was saying. Months. But the dinner was only. The recording started after the dinner. But my suspicions, those go back further. Daniel's voice steadied slightly, as if confessing was lifting a weight he'd carried too long. 6 months ago, I found a bank statement she'd hidden. Transfers to an account I'd never seen. When I traced it, the money was going to her parents. Thousands of dollars. Dad. Our savings, funneled out in small amounts she thought I wouldn't notice. My jaw tightened. "Go on." I started paying attention after that. Really paying attention. I found documents in her desk drawer, papers with my signature on them that I'd never signed, authorizations for things I'd never agreed to. And then I found the emails. He paused, swallowing hard. "She's been communicating with a lawyer, not a family lawyer, someone who specializes in guardianship cases. They've been discussing options for having you declared mentally incompetent." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though Michael had already warned me this was coming. Hearing it from Daniel, seeing the shame and anger warring in his eyes, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "She's planning to have you declared incompetent," Daniel continued. "The dinner, the insults, the way they've been treating you. It's all designed to create a narrative. The confused old man who can't manage his affairs, the paranoid father who needs protection from himself. Once they get guardianship, they'll have access to everything. Your house, your accounts, your entire life. And you've been recording all of this. Every chance I got. Phone in my pocket during dinner. Tablet hidden in the bedroom during her calls with her mother. The barbecue. I had a recorder running the whole time. His voice dropped. That's why I told you to be careful what you said around her. I needed you to play along without knowing why. If you'd confronted her, if you'd given any sign that we were on to her, she'd have destroyed everything before I could gather enough proof. I thought about the barbecue. Daniel in the corner, jaw tight, saying nothing while Evelyn made plans for my property. I'd interpreted his silence as weakness, or worse, complicity. But he'd been recording, documenting, building a case. I know you thought I betrayed you. His eyes glistened in the harsh diner lights. I needed her to think that, too. If she suspected for even a second that I was against her, she'd have covered her tracks. She's smart, Dad. Smarter than people give her credit for. The only way to catch her was to let her believe she'd already won. The waitress drifted by to refill our coffee. Neither of us touched it. Why didn't you come to me sooner? I asked when she was gone. Because I needed to be sure. Daniel's voice cracked again. For 7 years, I've been married to this woman. I thought I loved her. I thought she loved me. Finding out the truth, it didn't happen all at once. It came in pieces, each one worse than the last. I kept hoping I was wrong. Kept hoping there was some explanation that would make it all make sense. He shook his head. There wasn't. He pushed the USB drive across the table toward me. It's all on there. Recordings, bank statements, copies of the forged documents, screenshots of her emails with the guardianship lawyer. Everything you need to stop her. He paused. Everything we need to stop them. I picked up the drive, feeling its weight in my palm. Such a small thing to contain so much devastation. I'm sorry it took so long, Dad. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper now, his eyes bright with tears he was fighting to hold back. I had to be sure. Now I am. I looked at my son. Really looked at him, for the first time in years. The exhaustion carved into his face. The fear and determination battling in his eyes. The way his hands still trembled from the weight of what he'd been carrying alone. I'd spent weeks believing I'd lost him. I'd mourned the boy I remembered while resenting the man I thought he'd become. I'd been wrong. I reached across the table and gripped his hand. His fingers tightened around mine, like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. You didn't betray me, I said quietly. You were fighting beside me the whole time. I just couldn't see it. We sat in that diner booth until nearly 2 a.m., the coffee growing cold between us, while Daniel laid out the full scope of what Evelyn had been building. With each detail he revealed, the architecture of her scheme became clearer and more terrifying. It started about 8 months ago, Daniel said, his voice steadier now that the initial confession was behind him. She came to me with a stack of papers. Tax documents, she said. Estate planning updates. Things we needed to sign to protect ourselves financially. He shook his head slowly. I trusted her. I signed where she pointed without reading the fine print. What were they really? Most of them were legitimate decoys, to make me comfortable. But buried in the stack was a document giving her power of attorney over you if you were ever declared mentally unfit. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket and smoothed it on the table. She had a forged version of your signature on a separate form, a consent document, supposedly authorizing her to act on your behalf in medical and financial matters. Combined with a guardianship petition she's been preparing with that lawyer, she'd have complete control. I studied the document, recognizing the careful legalese designed to obscure its true purpose. And the dinner, the humiliation, evidence building. Every time they insulted you, every time you didn't fight back, it became part of the narrative. Confused elderly man can't stand up for himself. Pays bills he doesn't understand. Agrees to things that aren't in his interest. Daniel's jaw tightened. They were documenting your decline. A decline they were manufacturing themselves. The precision of it made my stomach turn. This wasn't opportunistic greed. This was systematic predation. Each piece carefully positioned like moves in a chess game I hadn't known I was playing. But here's what she doesn't know, Daniel continued, a faint spark of satisfaction breaking through his exhaustion. I recorded the conversation where she pressured me to sign those documents. She was very specific about what she wanted, very clear about the consequences if I refused. Threats about our marriage, about cutting me off from her parents' support. He paused. Under Wyoming law, any document signed under duress can be invalidated. Her own words are the proof. You have her on tape admitting coercion. Every word. And there's more. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. When I filed the power of attorney documents with the county, I made some mistakes. Accidentally used the wrong form number. Forgot to include a required witness signature. Transposed digits in the filing fee. He shrugged. Bureaucratic errors. The kind that make documents legally unenforceable until they are corrected and refiled. She doesn't know. She thinks everything is in place. She's been telling her parents for weeks that they are almost ready to move forward, but the foundation is rotten. She just doesn't know it yet. I leaned back in the booth, processing the implications. Daniel hadn't just been gathering evidence. He'd been actively sabotaging Evelyn's scheme from within, playing the role of a compliant husband while systematically dismantling her legal framework. What do we do now? I asked. Daniel's expression sobered. That's the hard part. We can't expose her yet. Everything I have, the recordings, the documents, the proof of her communications with the guardianship lawyer, it's enough to defend you if she makes her move, but it's not enough to destroy her completely. She could claim the recordings were taken out of context. She could say the forged signatures were honest mistakes. A good lawyer could create enough doubt to keep her out of serious trouble. So, we need more. We need her to make one more move. Something undeniable. Something witnessed by people who aren't family, who don't have a stake in the outcome. Daniel folded his hands on the table. Michael and I have been talking. He's preparing the legal counterattack, but timing is everything. If we move too soon, she'll slip away. If we wait too long, she might find another angle we haven't anticipated. The mention of Michael surprised me. You've been in contact with him? Since last week. Mom's letter. The one she left with him. It mentioned me by name. She wanted me to have a chance to choose the right side. His voice thickened. Michael reached out after you visited his office. He needed to know whose side I was really on. Grace. Even now, 5 years gone, she was still orchestrating from beyond the grave, still protecting both of us. What's my role? I asked. The hardest one. Daniel met my eyes. You have to keep playing the confused old man. Agreeable. Compliant, gradually warming to their attention. If they suspect for even a second that you're onto them, Evelyn will pivot. She'll find another way, something we haven't prepared for. He reached across the table and gripped my arm. I know it's humiliating. I know it goes against everything in you. But we're close, Dad. We just need to take one more step. I thought about the barbecue. Thomas's desperate bragging. Linda's panicked phone calls. Evelyn's constant checking of her bank account. They were drowning, and they believed I was their lifeline. The moment they grabbed for it, really grabbed, in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away, we'd have them. How long? Weeks, maybe. She's getting impatient. Her parents are pressuring her. The foreclosure on their house is moving forward, and they need money fast. Daniel's smile was grim. Desperate people make mistakes. We just have to be ready when she makes hers. We drove back to my house as the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon. Daniel dropped me at the end of my driveway, unwilling to risk his car being seen there at this hour. I'll be in touch, he said through the open window. Through Michael, not directly. Assume everything at our house is being monitored. I nodded and watched him drive away, the taillights disappearing into the morning mist. One signature would have stolen everything. My home, my savings, my autonomy. But the person Evelyn trusted most had been dismantling her plan from the inside. Now we just needed her to take one more step into the trap she'd built for me. 2 weeks passed in careful silence. I played my role, the agreeable old man, the compliant father, slowly warming to his family's attention. But behind the performance, I was preparing. Michael and I met twice more, refining the legal counterattack. Daniel fed me updates through encrypted messages, each one painting a clearer picture of Evelyn's growing impatience. The Carters were running out of time. Their foreclosure was accelerating. They needed my money, and they needed it now. It was time to force their hand. On a Tuesday morning, I drove to First Wyoming Bank and closed the joint account I'd shared with Daniel for the past 6 years. The account had been opened as an emergency fund, a way for Daniel to access money quickly if something happened to me. Over time, it had become something else, a pipeline Evelyn used to funnel funds to her parents without leaving obvious traces. The balance was just over $12,000. I transferred every cent to a new account at a different bank, one where no name but mine appeared on the paperwork. That afternoon, I called my insurance company and canceled the automatic payments for Daniel's car insurance. I'd been covering it temporarily for 3 years, ever since Evelyn convinced Daniel that consolidating their expenses would save money. Another small leak in the dam I'd finally decided to plug. The final move was the most deliberate. I waited until Evelyn called that evening with her usual sweetness, asking if I'd had a chance to think more about the property proposal. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that," I said, keeping my voice mild. "I've decided I should probably consult my own lawyer before making any changes to the estate, just to make sure everything's done properly." The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had a new edge beneath the sugar. "Of course, Dad. That's very thorough of you. Do you have someone in mind, or would you like me to recommend someone?" "I'll find someone," I said. "These things shouldn't be rushed." I hung up before she could respond. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Within 48 hours, my phone became a battlefield. Evelyn called 6 times the first day, her messages escalating from cheerful check-ins to thinly veiled concern about my state of mind. By the second day, her tone had shifted from sweet to desperate, her voicemails increasingly shrill. "Dad, I really think we should talk. I'm worried about you. You've been so isolated lately. That's not healthy." Thomas Carter called me directly for the first time in the 7 years I'd known him. His bluster couldn't quite conceal the panic underneath. "Richard, I hear you're having second thoughts about the estate planning. Let's not be hasty here. Family needs to stick together in times like these. I know a financial advisor who could explain everything. Make sure you understand what's really in your best interest." Linda's approach was more subtle, but equally transparent. She sent me an email, the first direct communication she'd ever initiated, with a subject line, "Thinking of you." The message was 3 paragraphs of passive-aggressive concern, peppered with phrases like family loyalty and the importance of trust. And, "I hope you haven't been listening to people who don't have your best interests at heart." She signed it, "With love and concern, Linda." Daniel's reports confirmed what I suspected. Evelyn had entered full crisis mode. She'd made frantic calls to 3 different banks, trying to find alternative sources of credit. She'd contacted the guardianship lawyer twice in one day, pushing to accelerate their timeline. She'd even reached out to a real estate agent about getting an emergency assessment of my property's value. "She's scared," Daniel told me during a brief phone call from his car, parked in a grocery store lot where Evelyn couldn't overhear. "Her parents are pressuring her constantly. The foreclosure notice came last week. They have 60 days to come up with the money or they lose the house. She's running out of options." "Good," I said. "Desperate people make mistakes. She's going to make her move soon." "Dad, be ready." The move came exactly 1 week later, delivered by certified mail. I stood at my kitchen counter and read the letter 3 times, making sure I understood every word. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, Henderson and Associates, specialists in elder law and guardianship proceedings. The letter informed me that a petition had been filed with the county court seeking protective guardianship over my person and estate. The petitioner was listed as Evelyn Carter Lawson, acting out of concern for the well-being of Richard Allen Lawson. The grounds cited were comprehensive and damning: cognitive decline evidenced by erratic financial decisions, increasing isolation from family support systems, paranoid behavior including the sudden closure of established accounts, and inability to manage personal affairs as demonstrated by failure to maintain consistent insurance coverage. The petition requested that the court appoint a guardian to oversee all financial and medical decisions on my behalf. A hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from the filing date. I set the letter down and looked out the window at the property Grace and I had built our life on. The garden she'd planted, the workshop where I'd taught Daniel to build birdhouses, the porch where we'd watched 1,000 sunsets together. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd loved, reduced to legal language designed to strip it all away. My phone buzzed. Another voicemail from Evelyn, her voice tight with manufactured worry. "Dad, please call me back. We need to talk about what's best for you. I'm only trying to help." I deleted it without listening to the rest. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't answer when they called. They thought I was losing control, withdrawing, isolating, proving their case about my declining mind. They didn't realize I'd just taken it back. The guardianship petition changed everything. Within hours of receiving it, I was on the phone with Michael Reeves, reading him the legal language word by word. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "The conditions have been met," he said finally. "It's time. Come to my office tomorrow morning. There's something you need to see." I arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, my stomach tight with anticipation. Michael was waiting for me in the same leather chair where we'd sat weeks earlier, but this time the sealed envelope lay open on his desk. Beside it sat a thick folder and a small USB drive. 5 years of secrets, finally ready to be revealed. "Sit down, Richard." His voice was gentle, in a way that made me nervous. "This is going to be difficult." He handed me a handwritten letter. The paper soft with age, the ink slightly faded. I recognized Grace's handwriting immediately. The elegant loops, the careful spacing, the way she always pressed too hard on her downstrikes. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. "My dearest Ray, if you're reading this, the storm I saw coming has finally arrived. I'm sorry I couldn't stop it, but I could prepare you." I had to set the letter down for a moment. Even after 5 years, her voice in my head was so clear it felt like she was sitting beside me. "I know you, my love. You see the best in people, even when they show you the worst. It's one of the things I've always loved about you, and one of the things that frightened me most as I watched our son's marriage unfold. I noticed Evelyn the moment I met her. Not because she was unkind. She was careful never to be overtly cruel. But I saw the way she studied you, cataloging your assets before she learned your name. At the wedding reception, while everyone else was dancing, I watched her examine our financial documents on Daniel's laptop. She thought no one was paying attention. I was. The letter continued for 2 more pages, each paragraph revealing another observation I'd missed. Grace had watched Linda coach Evelyn at family gatherings, the older woman whispering instructions that her daughter absorbed like lessons in a trade. She'd noticed how Evelyn's warmth toward me increased whenever money was discussed, and cooled whenever I mentioned anything personal. She documented small incidents, a conversation overheard, an expression caught, a pattern of behavior that painted a picture I'd been too blind to see. 6 months before I died, I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, and perhaps it was, but I needed to know if my suspicions were justified, or if illness was making me paranoid. What he found convinced me I wasn't imagining anything. The folder contains his full report. Read it carefully. What the Carters did to you, they've done before. Michael slid the folder across the desk. It was thick, at least 50 pages of typed reports, photographs, and official documents. The first page bore a header from Western Investigations, a firm based in Denver. The subject line read, "Background Investigation, Carter Family." I read for nearly an hour without speaking. Michael said quietly, refilling my coffee twice, saying nothing. The report painted a devastating picture. Before moving to Wyoming, the Carters had lived in Arizona for 8 years. During that time, Linda Carter had befriended an elderly woman named Helen Marsh, a widow whose husband had left her a substantial estate. Helen's son, Robert, had married a woman named Patricia 6 years before Helen's death. Patricia was Linda's niece. The pattern was identical to what I was living through now. Ingratiation, isolation from outside support, gradual financial control disguised as helpful estate planning. And when Helen Marsh began to resist, a guardianship petition, citing cognitive decline and erratic behavior, Helen signed over her property rights 8 months before she died. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, heart failure, not unexpected in a woman of 83. But the investigator had found irregularities. Neighbors who, reported that Helen seemed perfectly lucid in her final months. A doctor who'd examined her 2 weeks before the guardianship hearing and found no signs of dementia. A will that had been changed 3 times in the year before her death, each revision benefiting the Carter family more than the last. No charges were ever filed. No investigation was ever opened. The Carters sold Helen's house within 6 months of her death and moved to Wyoming, where Thomas started a new business and Linda began attending charity functions, where Evelyn met my son at a fundraiser 2 years later. The investigator's report included a final note. Based on the evidence gathered, it is my professional opinion that the Carter family operates as a coordinated unit, targeting elderly individuals with significant assets. Their methods are sophisticated and designed to avoid legal scrutiny. I recommend extreme caution in any financial dealings with this family. Grace had known. 5 years ago, while she was dying, she'd seen what was coming, and built a defense I didn't know existed. She'd gathered evidence, hired professionals, created legal structures to protect me, all while fighting a battle with her own body that she knew she was going to lose. I turned to the final page of her letter. The handwriting shakier here, as if she'd written it on one of her difficult days. Michael will help you fight this. The trust one created has provisions they can't circumvent. But I need you to promise me something. Protect yourself, my love. But remember, Daniel was a good boy once. If there's a path back for him, leave the door open. I stared at those words until they blurred. Even facing her own death, even knowing what Evelyn truly was, Grace had thought about redemption. Not for the Carters. She'd seen them too clearly for that. But for Daniel. For the son she'd loved since before he could walk. She'd planned for his redemption before anyone else believed he needed one. I spent 3 days studying every page of that investigator's report until I could recite the details from memory. Then I called Evelyn and asked her to arrange a family meeting at my house. I kept my voice uncertain, hesitant, the confused old man they expected me to be. I've been thinking about everything, I said. The petition. The property discussions. I think we should all sit down together and talk through my concerns. She agreed immediately, her tone bright with barely concealed triumph. She thought I was surrendering. They arrived on Saturday afternoon, pulling into my driveway in 2 cars like a convoy. Evelyn stepped out first, wearing a cream-colored blouse and pearls, the picture of concerned family devotion. Thomas followed, adjusting his jacket with the self-importance of a man who'd never been seriously challenged. Linda emerged last, her eyes scanning my property with the appraising look of someone calculating square footage. Daniel came separately, parking at the end of the driveway. His shoulders were slumped, his expression defeated, the henpecked husband I'd believed him to be for so long. He caught my eye for just a moment as he walked toward the house, the faintest nod. The performance was about to begin. I'd arranged chairs in my living room in a rough semicircle, positioning myself near the fireplace with my back to Grace's photograph. The investigator's report sat in a folder on the end table beside me, hidden beneath a copy of Asterisk Field and Stream Asterisk magazine. "Thank you all for coming," I said once everyone had settled. "I know things have been tense lately. I thought it might help if we cleared the air." "Of course, Dad." Evelyn leaned forward with manufactured warmth. "We're family. We should be able to talk about anything." "I appreciate that." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "Thomas, I've been meaning to ask, how's the business going? You mentioned some exciting developments at the barbecue." Thomas straightened in his chair, his chest puffing slightly. Very well. Very well. Several deals in the pipeline. You know how it is. Always something cooking. Funny. I heard the company filed for bankruptcy 2 years ago. Chapter 7. Complete liquidation. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. Linda's hand shot to his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. Where did you hear that? That's completely public records. Thomas, anyone can look them up. I turned to Linda before either of them could recover. Speaking of records, Linda, didn't you once mention a property in Phoenix? Something about a time you lived in Arizona. Her smile froze. I don't recall. A house on Saguaro Drive. Belonged to a woman named Helen Marsh. Ring any bells? The room went cold. I watched the Carters exchange glances. Quick, panicked, the silent communication of people whose secrets are unraveling. I'm not sure what you're implying, Linda said carefully, her voice strained. No implication, just curiosity. I shifted my attention to Evelyn, who had gone very still. While we're catching up, remind me, what did you do before you met Daniel? Something in healthcare, wasn't it? Evelyn's composure was remarkable, but I'd learned to read her. The slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before she spoke. I worked at a senior care facility. Administrative work. Nothing glamorous. Interesting. I imagine you learned a lot about how the system works. Guardianship proceedings, power of attorney, that sort of thing. Dad, her voice sharpened. What is this about? If you have concerns, we should discuss them openly. This kind of paranoid questioning. She gestured at her parents. This is exactly what we've been worried about. These erratic accusations, this suspicion toward people who love you. She softened her tone with practiced ease. It's okay to admit you need help. That's why we filed the petition. We just want to protect you. I reached for the folder beside me and removed the investigator's report. I set it on the coffee table between us, the cover page clearly visible. Background investigation, Carter family. Speaking of protection, I said quietly, I'd like to discuss Helen Marsh. Linda's face went white. Thomas clutched at his chest, his breathing suddenly shallow. But it was Evelyn whose reaction told me everything. Her mask didn't just slip, it shattered. For one unguarded moment, I saw the predator beneath the performance. Where did you get that? Her voice was barely a whisper. My wife gave it to me. 5 years ago. I met her eyes without flinching. She saw what you were from the beginning, Evelyn. She hired an investigator. She documented everything. The Arizona case, the pattern, all of it. She just wanted to give you time to change. I paused. You didn't. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas had gone gray, his hand still pressed to his chest. Linda stared at the report like it was a snake coiled on my coffee table. Daniel sat motionless, his performance forgotten, watching his wife with an expression I couldn't quite read. And Evelyn looked at me with eyes I'd never seen before. The sweetness was gone. The calculation was gone. What remained was something cold and cornered and very, very dangerous. You don't know what you're doing, she said finally, her voice flat. You have no idea what you've started. I know exactly what I'm doing, I replied. For the first time in years, the room went silent. For the first time, Evelyn had nothing to say. But the look in her eyes told me this wasn't over. Cornered animals were the most dangerous kind. The tension in the room was still crackling when the doorbell rang. I'd been expecting it. Michael Reeves stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase, his presence radiating the calm authority of a man who'd spent decades navigating courtrooms and confrontations. He nodded to me, then surveyed the Carters with the detached assessment of someone examining evidence. I apologize for the interruption, he said, though his tone suggested no apology at all. Richard asked me to join this discussion. Given the legal matters at hand, I thought it prudent to attend. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. And who exactly are you? Michael Reeves. I'm the trustee of Grace Lawson's estate, and Richard's legal counsel. He set his briefcase on the coffee table and clicked it open. I understand there's been some confusion about the family's financial arrangements. I'm here to clarify. Thomas found his voice, though it came out weaker than his usual bluster. Now, wait just a minute. This is a private family matter. We don't need lawyers turning this into something adversarial. I'm afraid the guardianship petition your daughter filed made it adversarial already, Mr. Carter. Michael withdrew a thick document bound in blue legal backing. Which brings me to why I'm here. He remained standing, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. Before her death, Grace Lawson created a living trust with several unusual provisions. She asked me to keep these details confidential unless specific circumstances arose. He paused. Those circumstances have now been met. Linda leaned forward. What circumstances? What are you talking about? The trust contains what's called a protection clause. It was designed to activate if Richard was ever subjected to elder abuse, financial, emotional, or legal. Michael's voice was measured, almost clinical. The filing of a guardianship petition based on fabricated claims of cognitive decline qualifies as legal abuse under the terms Grace specified. Evelyn's confident facade flickered. That petition was filed out of genuine concern. The clause has been triggered, Mrs. Lawson. As of the petition's filing date, all assets covered by the trust are frozen, pending a full review by me as trustee. That includes the house, all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and any property Richard owns. Michael let that sink in before continuing. No transfers, no sales, no changes of any kind can occur without my explicit written approval. Thomas's face had gone from gray to almost green. You can't do that. That's not legal. I assure you, it's entirely legal. Grace worked with 3 different attorneys to ensure these provisions would hold up under any challenge. Michael withdrew another document. But that's not the most significant aspect of the trust. He turned to face Evelyn directly. If the protection clause fully activates, which requires my determination that the abuse was intentional and systematic, the trust dictates that all assets be transferred to a charitable foundation, the Grace Lawson Memorial Foundation, to be specific. It would fund legal assistance for elderly victims of financial exploitation. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Linda was the first to understand. You mean Daniel wouldn't inherit anything? Correct. If I determine that Richard has been the victim of coordinated elder abuse, every asset in the trust passes to the foundation. Daniel and Evelyn would receive nothing. Evelyn shot to her feet. This is insane. Grace was dying when she wrote this. She was on medication. She wasn't thinking clearly. Any court would throw this out as the product of a confused mind. Michael smiled faintly. Grace anticipated that argument. The trust includes video testimony recorded before witnesses, along with a comprehensive cognitive evaluation conducted by an independent psychiatrist 2 weeks before she passed. She was, by all professional assessments, completely lucid. He paused. She simply saw things others refused to see. However, Michael continued, Grace was not without mercy. The trust includes a redemption provision specifically for Daniel. My son looked up sharply, his performance of defeated husband forgotten. Daniel has 90 days from the triggering event to provide evidence that he was not complicit in any scheme against his father. If he cooperates fully with any investigation and demonstrates that he actively worked to protect Richard rather than harm him, the trust's punitive provisions can be suspended as they apply to him. Michael turned to Daniel. Your mother believed in you. She wanted to give you a path back if you chose to take it. The room fell silent again. Evelyn stood frozen in place, calculations visibly racing behind her eyes. Then slowly, her expression shifted. Her shoulders dropped. Her lip trembled. Tears began streaming down her cheeks. I can't believe this, she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't believe you're all doing this to me. I was only trying to help. Richard's been struggling. Anyone can see that. I just wanted to make sure he was taken care of. She turned to me, mascara running. Dad, I love you. I know we've had our differences, but everything I've done has been out of concern. Grace, she was confused at the end. The cancer, the medication. You can't hold me responsible for the paranoid fantasies of a dying woman. It was a masterful performance. Even knowing what I knew, part of me felt the pull of her apparent sincerity. I saw Thomas and Linda watching, hopefully, waiting to see if the manipulation would work. Then Daniel stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, commanding attention without demanding it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands weren't shaking anymore. I think everyone needs to hear something, he said quietly. He pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the room, tiny through the phone speaker, but perfectly clear. Once we get guardianship, it's done. The house is worth at least $400,000. We sell it fast, split it 3 ways. My parents take their share to cover the foreclosure. We take ours. By the time anyone figures out what happened, the old man will be in a home somewhere, and we'll be long gone. A second voice. Linda's. And if he fights it? He won't. He's too proud to admit he's losing his mind. And even if he tries, who's going to believe him? We've been building this case for months. Erratic behavior, isolation, paranoid accusations. The court will see exactly what we want them to see. Daniel pressed stop. The silence that followed was absolute. Evelyn's face collapsed in stages. Disbelief. Fury. Then something I'd never seen before. She looked at Daniel like she was seeing him for the first time. You recorded me. He met her eyes without flinching. I learned from the best. The recording ended, but its echo seemed to hang in the room like a verdict. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Thomas Carter clutched his chest and collapsed sideways on my couch, his face contorted in pain. The next hour was chaos. Linda screamed for someone to call an ambulance. Evelyn stood frozen, her tear-streaked face now pale with genuine fear rather than performed emotion. Daniel called 911 while I guided the paramedics through my front door. They loaded Thomas onto a stretcher, oxygen mask pressed to his face, and rushed him to the hospital, with Linda following in her car. Evelyn tried to go with him, but Daniel stopped her at the door. You should stay, he said, his voice flat. We need to talk about what happens next. She stared at him like he was a stranger. In many ways, I suppose he was. Thomas survived. The doctors called it a severe panic attack, complicated by undiagnosed heart disease. Years of stress and denial manifesting in a crisis he could no longer outrun. He spent 3 days in the cardiac unit while his carefully constructed world continued to crumble around him. Linda called me from the hospital waiting room the second night. Her voice had lost its usual Polish, replaced by something raw and desperate. Richard, please, surely we can work something out. She paused, and I heard the exhaustion beneath her words. Families have disagreements. Things get said in the heat of the moment. That recording. Evelyn was just venting. You know how it is. She didn't mean any of it. I pressed the record button on my phone and let her continue. I may have guided her approach a little. I admit that. But it was never supposed to go this far. We just needed help, Richard. The foreclosure. The business collapsed. We were drowning. Can't you understand that? Her voice cracked. What if we just forget all this unpleasantness? A small settlement to help us get back on our feet, and we'll drop the petition, disappear from your life completely. Everyone walks away. No courts, no investigations, no public scandal. You're asking me to pay you off, I said quietly. I'm asking you to show mercy. For Daniel's sake, if nothing else. I ended the call and saved the recording. Mercy was exactly what Grace had asked me to show. But not for the Carters. For my son. The collapse happened faster than I expected. Guardianship petitions are public record in Wyoming, and small towns have long memories. Within days, the legal community was buzzing with whispers about the case. Michael told me later that 3 different attorneys had called him, asking about the investigator's report. One of them had a client in Arizona, a woman named Susan Marsh, Helen's daughter-in-law, who had spent years suspecting something was wrong about her mother-in-law's final months, but could never prove it. Susan Marsh contacted the Wyoming Department of Family Services. She also called a detective in Phoenix who had investigated Helen's case before it was quietly closed. The calls led to more calls. Old files were reopened. Patterns that had been invisible in isolation became obvious when connected. The Carters' foreclosure proceeded without interruption. The bank had been patient for months, but patience has limits. The auction was scheduled for the end of the month. Thomas watched from his hospital bed while his wife scrambled to find solutions that no longer existed. Evelyn's world contracted around her like a closing fist. Daniel filed for divorce 3 days after the confrontation, citing fraud and coercion. The paperwork was brutal in its precision. Michael had helped prepare it, documenting every forged signature, every funneled dollar, every recorded conversation. Evelyn retained a lawyer, but even he seemed to recognize a losing battle. The Wyoming Department of Family Services opened a formal investigation into elder abuse. An investigator interviewed me for 2 hours, asking detailed questions about the dinner at Carmichael's, the property proposal, the guardianship petition. I showed her the evidence Daniel had gathered, the investigator's report Grace had commissioned, the recording of Linda offering a settlement in exchange for silence. She took notes without expression, but I saw the tightening around her eyes when she heard Linda's voice admitting she'd guided Evelyn's approach. The lawyer who had prepared Evelyn's guardianship petition withdrew from the case, citing newly discovered conflicts of interest. Translation: He'd realized his client had used him as a tool in an elder abuse scheme, and he wanted no part of the consequences. The final collapse came on a Tuesday afternoon. Evelyn called Daniel. I learned this later, begging him to intervene. She needed money for her legal defense. She needed someone to speak on her behalf. She needed help. Daniel told her to call her parents. She tried. Linda's phone went straight to voicemail. Thomas, released from the hospital but facing his own legal exposure from the Arizona investigation, had stopped answering calls entirely. The family that had operated as a coordinated, predatory unit for years had fractured under pressure, each member scrambling to save themselves. I watched it all from a distance, feeling less like a victor than a witness to a natural disaster. These people had tried to steal everything I'd built. They'd manipulated my son, desecrated my wife's memory, and treated me like an obstacle to be removed. By every measure of justice, they deserved what was happening to them. But watching the destruction, Thomas's gray face in the ambulance, Linda's desperate phone call, Evelyn standing alone in my living room as her marriage and her schemes collapsed simultaneously, I couldn't summon the satisfaction I'd expected to feel. They'd spent years building a facade of success and respectability. It took 2 weeks for it all to collapse. But I didn't feel triumph watching them fall. I felt tired, and something like pity for the people they might have been. A week after the confrontation, Daniel's car appeared in my driveway again. This time, it was mid-afternoon, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the yard. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up, the way family used to before everything became complicated. I met him at the door, and for a moment neither of us spoke. He looked different somehow, not just tired, though he was clearly exhausted. Something in his posture had shifted. The performance was over. The man standing on my porch was simply my son, stripped of pretense and unsure what came next. "I'm not here to talk strategy," he said quietly. "I just needed to be somewhere that felt like home." I stepped aside and let him in. We ended up on the back porch, sitting in the old wooden chairs Grace had picked out 20 years ago. This was where she and I had spent countless evenings, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, talking about nothing and everything. After she died, I'd avoided the porch for months. The emptiness of the second chair had been too much to bear. Now Daniel sat in it, and the rightness of that felt like a small grace. For a long time, we shared silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling, that exists between people who've been through something together and don't need words to acknowledge it. A hulk circled lazily in the distance, riding thermals I couldn't see. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I keep trying to figure out when it started." His voice was rough, as if the words had to fight their way out. "When I stopped being myself and started being whoever she needed me to be. But there wasn't a single moment. It was gradual. So gradual I didn't notice until I couldn't recognize myself anymore." I waited, letting him find his own pace. In the beginning, she was everything I thought I wanted. Smart, confident, ambitious. She had this way of making me feel like I was the center of her world. He laughed bitterly. I didn't realize she was just figuring out how to manage me. By the time I understood what was happening, I'd already handed her all the control. My finances, my friendships, my relationship with you and Mom. She isolated me so carefully. I thought I was making my own choices. "Why didn't you come to us?" "Shame." The word came out like a confession. I was ashamed that I'd let it happen. That I couldn't see what she was doing. That I was too weak to stop it. He turned to look at me, his eyes red-rimmed. And I kept thinking I could fix it from inside. That if I just understood her better, loved her better, tried harder, I could change things, make it work. He shook his head. I was wrong about all of it. I thought about all the signs I'd missed. The cancelled fishing trips, the unanswered calls, the way Daniel had seemed to shrink over the years, becoming less present, less himself. I'd attributed it to work stress, to the normal drift that happens between parents and adult children. I'd never imagined he was drowning. "Your mother saw it," I said. "Before any of us." "I know." His voice cracked. "I've been thinking about that a lot. How she tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. How she must have felt watching what was happening and knowing she couldn't stop it." I stood and went inside, returning with Grace's letter. I'd read it so many times the paper had grown soft at the folds. I handed it to Daniel and pointed to a section near the middle, the part she'd written specifically for him. He read it aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Danny, if you're reading this, you found your way back. I never doubted you would. Remember what I told you when you were 10? Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing, even when you are. You were afraid for years, sweetheart. But you're not anymore. That's all the proof I need that the boy I raised is still in there. Daniel stopped reading. His shoulders began to shake. The sound that came from him wasn't crying exactly. It was something deeper, more primal. The release of years of suppressed grief and guilt and fear. He pressed the letter to his chest and wept the way he hadn't since the day we buried his mother. I moved my chair closer and put my hand on his shoulder. There was nothing to say. Some pain can only be witnessed, not fixed. When he finally collected himself, the sun had dropped below the tree line. The porch was bathed in the soft purple light of dusk, the air cooling around us. I'm going to testify, he said, his voice steadier now. Whatever the investigators need, whatever the courts require, I'll tell them everything. I know you will. And I started seeing someone. A therapist. Someone who specializes in. He hesitated. In helping people who've been in controlling relationships. I need to understand how I let this happen. I need to make sure it never happens again. I nodded. That takes courage, too. We sat in silence again, but it felt different now. Lighter somehow. The weight of secrets and performance had lifted, leaving something fragile but real in its place. Rebuilding wouldn't be instant. I knew that. Trust, once broken, doesn't repair overnight. There would be awkward conversations and difficult moments. Times when the memory of those years, the unanswered calls, the dinner at Carmichael's, the look in his eyes when he pushed that bill toward me, would rise up and make forgiveness feel impossible. But Grace had understood something I was only beginning to grasp. Leaving the door open for redemption didn't mean excusing the hurt. It didn't mean pretending the betrayal hadn't happened. It meant believing that people could change if they chose to. And Daniel was choosing. Dad, his voice was small in the gathering darkness. Do you think you can ever forgive me? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the boy who used to build birdhouses in my workshop, who sat beside his mother's hospital bed reading her favorite books, who had somehow found the courage to dismantle his own life in order to save mine. I already have, I told him. Your mother forgave you before she died. The only person left to forgive is yourself. He nodded slowly, absorbing the words. It would take time, but we had time now. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Daniel came by regularly, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk. We were relearning each other, filling in the gaps that years of distance and deception had carved between us. It wasn't always comfortable. Some conversations stumbled into painful territory and had to be navigated carefully. But we kept showing up, and that counted for something. One evening in late October, Daniel arrived with a bottle of wine and an expression I couldn't quite read. We settled into our usual spots on the porch, the autumn air carrying the first hints of winter's approach. He poured 2 glasses and handed one to me, then stared at his own for a long moment before speaking. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Something I did that you don't know about. My chest tightened. After everything we'd been through, I thought the secrets were finally over. What is it? About a month ago, before the confrontation, before any of this became public, I sent copies of everything to the FBI. He met my eyes. The recordings, the financial documents, the investigators' report on Helen Marsh. All of it. I also contacted authorities in Arizona and gave them what I had on the Phoenix case. I set down my wine glass. You never mentioned that. I wasn't sure how you'd react, and I wanted to make sure it actually went somewhere before I said anything. He leaned forward, his voice intense. It wasn't just about protecting you, Dad. It was about making sure they can't do this to anyone else. The Carters, they've been doing this for years. Helen Marsh wasn't the first, and you wouldn't have been the last. Someone had to stop them permanently. I thought about my son, the man I believed was too weak to stand up to his wife, too compromised to do the right thing. He'd been building a case for months, dismantling Evelyn's schemes from within. And then, without telling anyone, he'd taken the evidence to federal authorities because he understood that personal justice wasn't enough. You could have been exposed, I said, if Evelyn had found out. I know, but some things matter more than safety. He smiled faintly. Mom taught me that. I just forgot for a while. The investigation Daniel had triggered expanded faster than either of us anticipated. Within weeks of his initial contact, the FBI's Elder Fraud Division had opened a formal inquiry into the Carter family's activities, spanning multiple states. 2 other families came forward with stories eerily similar to mine and Helen Marsh's, a couple in Nevada whose elderly mother had signed over her savings before a mysterious fall, and a widower in New Mexico who had been isolated from his children before his assets were transferred to caregivers he barely knew. The connections were undeniable. The Carters had been running variations of the same scheme for nearly a decade. Linda faced federal charges for wire fraud related to the money Evelyn had funneled to her parents across state lines. The evidence Daniel had gathered, bank records, recorded conversations, documentation of the systematic transfers, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Thomas, his heart condition worsening under the weight of legal pressure and public exposure, was deemed too ill to stand trial. He spent most of his days in a K facility now, the bills mounting faster than his non-existent resources could cover. Evelyn made a different calculation. Facing multiple state and federal charges, she chose to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced sentencing. Her testimony filled in gaps that documentation alone couldn't provide. She admitted to a pattern of targeting elderly individuals through elder care facilities, using her professional access to identify vulnerable marks. She explained how Linda had coached her since childhood, treating marriage as a financial strategy rather than a partnership. She detailed schemes I'd never known about, attempts that had failed, families who escaped close calls that had taught her to be more careful. I listened to the updates from Michael with a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. These were people who had tried to destroy me, but they were also people, broken, desperate, shaped by circumstances I couldn't fully understand. I didn't forgive them. I wasn't sure I ever would. But I no longer felt the burning anger that had sustained me through the worst of it. One afternoon, Michael and I sat in his office, discussing the future of Grace's trust. The protective provisions had served their purpose. My assets were secure. Daniel's redemption path was clear. And the Carters no longer posed any threat. The question now was what to do with what remained. Grace left you considerable resources, Michael said. More than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. But I know she'd want you to think about legacy. Legacy. The word felt heavy in my mouth. I thought about Helen Marsh, who had died without anyone to fight for her. About the families in Nevada and New Mexico who had suffered in silence because they didn't know where to turn. About all the elderly people across the country who were being manipulated by the people they trusted most, with no investigator's report to save them. I want to start a foundation, I said. Michael raised an eyebrow. What kind? The Grace Lawson Foundation for Elder Protection. Legal resources for seniors facing financial exploitation, especially by family members. Help for people who don't have lawyers or investigators or sons brave enough to record their abusers. I paused. Grace's report exposed the Carters. I want to help create 1,000 more reports. Expose 1,000 more predators. Michael nodded slowly, making notes. That's a significant undertaking. You'd need staff, partnerships with legal aid organizations, a whole infrastructure. Then we'll build it. He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this began. Grace would be proud. We spent the next hour discussing logistics, funding structures, nonprofit requirements, potential partnerships with existing elder advocacy groups. When we'd cover the basics, Michael looked up from his notes. One more thing. What do you want the Foundation's mission statement to be? I thought about Grace. About the letter she'd left me, the fortress she'd built, the door she'd insisted I leave open for Daniel. About all the kindness I'd shown the Carters over the years, the loans never repaid, the insults absorbed, the dignity surrendered in the name of family peace. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used, I said. Finally, let's help people learn where to draw the line. 6 months can change everything. Or perhaps it simply reveals what was always possible, waiting beneath the surface for the right conditions to emerge. My house looks the same from the outside. The same white siding Grace chose when we built it. The same blue shutters I've repainted every 5 years. The same gravel driveway that crunches under tires in a way that always told her I was home. But inside, everything is different. The spare bedroom that sat empty for years has become an informal office for the foundation. Filing cabinets line one wall, stuffed with case files and legal templates. A second-hand desk holds my laptop, where I spend mornings answering emails from families across the country who found us through our website or word of mouth. Daniel visits every weekend now, sometimes more often. He brings groceries I don't need and fixes things around the house that aren't broken, excuses to be here, to rebuild what we almost lost. Occasionally, he arrives with friends from his therapy group, men and women who are reconstructing their lives after controlling relationships. We sit on the porch and talk, or we work in the garden, or we simply share space without needing to fill it with words. The garden itself has been transformed. Daniel and I spent an entire spring weekend restoring the beds Grace planted decades ago. The roses are thriving again. The herbs have spread beyond their borders. Life, stubbornly reasserting itself. The world kept turning while we healed, and the people who tried to destroy us faced their own reckonings. Evelyn accepted a plea deal, 5 years probation, mandatory counseling, community service with an elder advocacy organization. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'll never fully acknowledge what she did. Her therapist reports that she still frames herself as a victim of circumstances rather than architect of harm. But she's no longer a threat. The legal constraints ensure that, and her own diminished circumstances do the rest. Thomas Carter never recovered from the stress of exposure. His heart, weakened by years of hidden disease and the strain of maintaining an elaborate fiction, gave out 3 months after the confrontation in my living room. I didn't attend the funeral. Neither did Daniel. Linda, alone now and facing her own federal charges, took a plea deal that kept her out of prison in exchange for testimony against other members of the network she'd helped build over the years. Last I heard, she'd moved to Nevada to live with a distant cousin, her social standing and financial resources both exhausted. The Carter family home, that sprawling colonial where they'd performed prosperity for so many years, sold at auction to a young couple with 2 children. I drove past it once, a few weeks after they moved in. There were bicycles in the driveway and a swing set in the backyard. The hedges that had hidden the foreclosure sign were gone, replaced by a vegetable garden. New life in a space that had held so much deception. Daniel's divorce was finalized in April. He signed the papers without ceremony, closed that chapter of his life with the same quiet determination he'd shown throughout. A month later, he introduced me to someone new, a woman named Sarah, who works as a librarian at the community college. She laughs easily, asks questions because she's genuinely curious about the answers, and looks at Daniel with uncomplicated affection. When she shook my hand for the first time, her grip was firm, and her smile reached her eyes. I liked her immediately. On the anniversary of Grace's death, I drove to the cemetery with a bouquet of yellow roses, her favorites. The one she always said reminded her of sunshine captured in petals. The grounds were quiet in the late afternoon light, the grass still green despite the approaching autumn. I found her headstone and settled onto the small bench I'd had installed years ago, when sitting on the ground became harder than my pride wanted to admit. I have a lot to tell you, I said. I told her about the foundation. 17 families helped in just 6 months. Legal resources provided. Predators exposed. Boundaries drawn. I told her about Daniel, about his therapy and his healing, and the way he'd become an advocate himself, speaking at community centers about the warning signs of financial exploitation. I told her about Sarah, and about the garden, and about the way her roses had bloomed brighter this year than any year since she died. And I told her she was right about Evelyn, about the investigator, about leaving the door open for Daniel, about everything. She'd seen the storm coming 5 years before it arrived, and built a shelter I didn't know I needed. She'd trusted that our son would find his way back, even when I'd given up hope. She'd understood that protection and love weren't opposites, that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was prepare the people you cherish for battles you wouldn't be there to fight. The sun sank toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the grass. The light turned golden, then amber, then the soft purple of approaching dusk. I sat with my wife's memory and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of pain, that never fully leaves, but the presence of something stronger. Purpose. The knowledge that what I'd built would outlast me. That Grace's foresight would protect people she'd never meet. That our son had become a man she would have been proud of. I stood slowly, my knees protesting the way they always did now, and placed the roses against her headstone. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." I didn't win by destroying anyone. I won by protecting what mattered and letting go of what didn't. Grace taught me that love isn't just about holding on. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for. I finally understood, and for the first time since she left, I felt like I'd made her proud. And that, my friends, is the story of how one dinner invitation revealed a conspiracy that had been building for years. Richard Lawson walked into that restaurant expecting a family meal and discovered instead that the people closest to him had been planning to take everything he had worked his entire life to build. But what Evelyn and the Carters never anticipated was that Grace Lawson had seen them coming half a decade before they made their move. She built a fortress her husband did not know existed, and left the blueprints with a trusted friend, waiting for the day Richard would need them. This story reminds us that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and that the people who underestimate quiet strength often learn that lesson too late. It also teaches us that redemption is possible when someone chooses courage over comfort, as Daniel did when he decided to stand with his father instead of the woman who had manipulated him for years. I know this was a wild ride. It still feels surreal to me sometimes. But I truly want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were me, sitting at that table? Or if you were Daniel, trapped in that situation? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and what you knew was right? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say.